October is one of my favorite months to fish out of the whole year, but it can be difficult if you don't know where to look for the bass at or what to throw. If you know what you're doing while out on the water during October, you will have some of the best fishing of the whole entire year. I love fishing during the fall because of how aggressive they are, and you can catch them on many different presentations depending on the mood of the bass for that day. Whenever it comes to selecting lures to use in October, it is important to think about where the bass go whenever the water temperature starts to get cooler, like it does during October, and what they are feeding on in your local body of water. During the fall, bass will only have one thing on their mind, and that's to feed up on bait fish. During the fall, you can have some of the best fishing days of the whole entire year, and it is what I look forward to most as an angler. You can catch some good quality bass this time of year if you know where to look. It was very difficult to select just 5 lures to talk about for this month, so I decided to add a bonus lure. These 6 lures are my confidence baits to use whenever I'm fishing during October, and I have caught some very nice fish fishing these lures during October. These lures will work in many conditions across the country and catch some absolute giant bass during October. Let me know down below if you agree or disagree with my top 5 October lures in the comments section down below. It was very difficult for me to select just 5 and a bonus lure, so I guarantee I missed some. So let me know down below what you like to throw this time of year. Also, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. It would mean the world to me. We are on the way to 5K by the end of the year, and I would love to have you join the community. At the time of recording this video, we are at 2.9K, and honestly, I cannot believe how much the channel has grown, and I love how you guys support the videos, so it really does mean a lot to me. So if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do. The first lure I want to talk about today is the jerkbait. The jerkbait is an important lure to have tied on this time of year due to the colder water temperatures. The jerkbait shines in colder water temperatures and is one of my favorite lures to use through the fall and throughout the whole entire winter. The jerkbait catches some huge bass, especially whenever the water temperature drops like it does in October. Whenever it comes down to selecting what to imitate whenever you're throwing a jerkbait, I love to imitate the bait fish that are in the body of water that I am fishing. I mainly throw colors to imitate shad, blueback herring, or other bait fish that the bass will be feeding on during October. However, it really depends on what the bass are feeding on in the body of water you are fishing. For example, some lakes in the country might have a large population of bluegills that the bass will feed on during the fall, while other lakes might have perch that the bass might feed on during the fall. It really just depends. However, in many scenarios, they are feeding up on shad this time of year, but it really depends on what's in the body of water you are fishing. I like fishing a jerkbait or a soft style jerkbait depending on what type of cover I am fishing around. Whenever choosing a jerkbait, I always reach for a Megabass Vision 110 due to its lifelike action whenever you are working it throughout the water column. Compared to other jerkbaits in my opinion, the Megabass Vision 110 has the best action of any jerkbait on the whole entire market. The Megabass Vision 110 has caught me many nice bass over the years and is a staple to have in any tackle box. Whenever I'm fishing a jerkbait, I am normally fishing it in more open water situations or closer to the bank depending on where the bass are feeding at for that day. Whenever it comes down to selecting a soft style jerkbait to use, most of the time I like to go with a fluke made by Zoom or a fluke made by Strike King. I like to fish the soft style jerkbait around cover that I would not normally fish the Megabass Vision 110 around due to me Texas rigging the hooks so the fluke does not get hung up as much. Whenever it comes down to selecting what jerkbait or soft style jerkbait to use, it really comes down to personal preference and what you like to use at the end of the day. You can never go wrong with having a jerkbait tied on this time of year, and you will catch some huge bass if you are using this lure in October. The second lure I want to talk to you about today is the crankbait. During the fall, the bass are keyed in heavily on bait fish and are getting ready for the winter. The crankbait truly shines during the fall with how many different forages you can imitate and how deep you can fish your crankbait depending on where the bass are at that day. Whenever I am fishing a crankbait during the fall, I normally like to match the hatch wherever I'm fishing, but generally I like to imitate a shad, a blueback herring, or a bluegill. However, it really depends on what the bass are keyed in on in the body of water that you are fishing. During the fall, bass will be pushing the bait fish up into the backs of pockets. However, don't be afraid to fish deeper especially whenever you see bait fish in deeper water. This is whenever the crankbait truly shines, because you can use a square bill to target the shallow bass, or you can use a deep diving crankbait to target the bass that are in deeper water. You can also use many different crankbaits with different diving depths. It really just depends on where the bait fish are relating at on the body of water that you are fishing. However, this really depends on where the bass are staging up in your local body of water, but this will be a good way for you to narrow down where you should target them at. The crankbait is one of my confidence lures and has caught me several big bass whenever I am using it. You can trigger some aggressive reaction strikes whenever you are fishing the crankbait. My favorite way to trigger these reaction strikes out of the bass during the fall is deflecting the crankbait off a cover or giving it pauses whenever I am reeling it in very quickly. This gives the bass no time to react, and they quickly have to decide if they are going to bite it or not and pass up an easy meal. You can trick the biggest bass in the body of water that you are fishing by burning a crankbait, especially if you're fishing in the right area. You can even add some pauses to trigger even the most hesitant of bass to bite your lure. Make sure whenever you're out fishing during October that you have a crankbait tied on, and you will catch some huge bass using this lure. The third lure I'm going to talk about today is the Wacky Rig. The Wacky Rig is an excellent bait to use this time of year, especially whenever the bass are pushed up shallow. The Wacky Rig has a very unique action whenever it is falling throughout the water column, and the bass will slam it. Many people do not throw the Wacky Rig during the fall, but this is one of the most effective lures you can use this time of year, especially whenever the bass are not wanting to hit a moving bait. I was recently fishing on Lake Guntersville a couple weeks ago, and I caught some good sized bass utilizing the Wacky Rig around grass lines. I especially love using the Wacky Rig whenever I'm targeting largemouth, but have success too using it with smallmouth and spotted bass. The Wacky Rig is a versatile rig due to how you can change up the action of the bait completely just by changing up what worm you use. Depending on what worm you decide to use will determine how quickly your Wacky Rig will fall throughout the water column. For example, the Yum Dinger is one of the slowest sinking worms that you can use, while the Gary Yamamoto Senko will sink much more quickly throughout the water column compared to the Yum Dinger. Depending on the mood of the bass for that day will determine what worm that you should use, so it is important to see what the bass react to more. Some days they want a slower sinking worm, while on other days they want the faster sinking one. So you're just going to have to experiment to see what works. It can be fished in many different scenarios and shines whenever targeting shallow bass. Many people don't like to throw the Wacky Rig because they think it catches small bass, but I am here to tell you today that the Wacky Rig can catch some massive bass. Whenever I see shallow water, one of the first lures to pop in my head is the Wacky Rig, especially if I need to skip it up underneath something. I love to skip the Wacky Rig up under docks or under branches that are hanging over the bank. Normally, I will trigger a reaction strike whenever I am skipping it up under cover. It is one of my favorite lures to skip and is honestly probably one of the easiest lures to skip in my opinion. If you do not have a Wacky Rig tied on this time of year, you are missing out on one of the best finesse baits to use whenever the bass are up shallow. It was hard to select just 5 lures to talk about this month, so I decided to add a bonus lure. The bonus lure I'm going to talk about today is the spinnerbait. One of the first lures to pop in my head whenever I think about fall bass fishing is the spinnerbait. The spinnerbait is so effective during the fall because of how well it mimics bait fish depending on what color you choose. This time of year I like to mimic shad or blueback herring depending on where I'm fishing at. Here in the Carolinas we have an abundance of blueback herring, and the bass go absolutely crazy this time of year whenever they are targeting blueback herring. However, it really depends on where you're fishing at in the country to determine what exactly you should imitate whenever you are throwing a spinnerbait. For example, let's say the main forage in your local body of water is bluegill. You're probably going to want to imitate a bluegill whenever you are throwing a spinnerbait. The spinnerbait really shines whenever you are fishing it on windy or overcast days, or if the water is stained. During October, the bass will absolutely destroy a spinnerbait, especially if you work some action into it whenever you are fishing the spinnerbait. My personal favorite spinnerbait to use this time of year is a War Eagle with a Kitech trailer on the back. However, it really does come down to personal preference and what spinnerbait and trailer you like. so make sure you experiment to see what works best for you. The spinnerbait does well around many different types of cover and does not get hung up compared to other lures. Whenever the bass are feeding up on bait fish like they are in October, one of the first lures I will always pick up is the spinnerbait. The fourth lure I'm going to talk about today is the jig. The jig is probably one of my favorite lures to throw all year, and especially in October. A jig can produce some huge bites during the fall and is one of my confidence lures to catch big bass this time of year. Bass will be relating more to shallow water, pushing the bait fish up shallow so they can feed to get ready for the winter. The jig works well in many different situations, especially around wood and docks. However, I like to fish the jig around rocks too, depending on where the bass are located at that day, but my main priority is going to be docks or wood. Being able to fish the jig slowly in these types of areas is a good way to target bass that won't bite any other lure. This time of year, I like to throw 3 different styles of jigs. The first one I like to throw is a football jig. The football jig is my go-to jig most of the time because I have a lot of confidence in it and it catches some good bass, especially if you're fishing it shallow. I was on a lake here in western North Carolina throwing a football jig trying to target shallow and deeper bass. Whenever I am fishing the jig this time of year, I prefer to fish it slowly so I can stay in the strike zone for even longer. Fishing the jig slowly this time of year can trigger even the most lethargic bass into biting the jig. The second type of jig I like to use is the swim jig. The swim jig does well imitating blueback herring, shad, or bluegill depending on where you're fishing at in the country. The swim jig can cover a lot of water and is a good alternative whenever the bass are not wanting to bite a spinnerbait. You can fish the swim jig around pretty much any type of cover and you will catch some nice bass fishing the swim jig. The third style jig I like to use is the finesse jig. The finesse jig does well especially whenever the bass are not wanting to commit to a full-size jig presentation and catches some giant bass. Don't think the jig can only be used in deeper water, it works well up shallow too. It's all really dependent on what type of cover you are fishing around. There's many different types of jigs and trailers to choose from and can become very overwhelming to somebody who is new to fishing jigs. I plan on doing a more in-depth video talking about jigs in the future, so if you're interested in that, make sure you comment down below and let me know. And also don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on that video. The jig can be fished in many different scenarios and truly does shine in the fall to catch some giant bass. The drawing power of a large profile jig can result in some huge bites and is one of my favorite techniques to target those big fish. The fifth lure I want to talk about today is the drop shot. Whenever the bite gets tough during these October days, I will always reach for the drop shot. There's something special about fishing a drop shot this time of year, especially whenever the bass are feeding on bait fish. The drop shot can be one of the most effective lures to use, especially whenever the bass are not wanting to hit a moving bait. The 2 most important things to consider whenever you are fishing a drop shot is what soft plastic you use and what hook you use to rig it. Whenever it comes down to selecting what plastic you should use, it really depends on what the bass are feeding on in your local body of water. Personally, I like to match the hatch of whatever the bass are feeding on so I can get the most bites whenever I'm out on the water. Generally this time of year, I like to mimic blueback herring, shad, or bluegill depending on where I'm fishing at. Whenever it comes down to selecting what type of hook you should use, it is important to consider what type of cover you are fishing around. If you are going to be fishing around a lot of wood, for example, you might want to Texas rig your drop shot so you do not get hung up as much. However, most of the time I like to nose hook my soft plastic because I feel like this gives it the most action whenever you are working it throughout the water column. It really does come down to personal preference and what works best for you. The drop shot shines in many different types of conditions and just straight up catches big bass. Make sure whenever you're out this month that you have the drop shot tied on. These are my top 5 lures to use in October, and these lures will help you catch more bass whenever you are fishing during the fall. It was hard to select just 5 lures and a bonus lure, so I'm sure that I missed some lures that you might use during the fall. So let me know down below if I missed your favorite lure to use in October or not. These should work in many different scenarios across the whole entire country. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down in the comment section down below. Also, let me know in the comment section down below if you agree or disagree with my top 5 lures to use during October. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button to help this video in the YouTube algorithm so more people can get recommended this video. If you are not subscribed and you made it this far throughout the video, please consider subscribing. We are on the way to 5K by the end of the year, and I would love to have you join the community. If you want to see how effective a jig can be this time of year, make sure you check out this video right here.